Hi, Ted Morrissey here, and I wanted to do this video for a while, but it seems like every time I've sat down to do it over the last 2 or 3 weeks, something intervenes. But it's a video ostensibly for my course on the novella and long story in the MFA program, and it deals specifically with the idea of transitioning from being a short story writer to being a novelist. And the course actually was designed specifically for that anxiety, that concern, whatever you want to call it, because so many story writers want to be novelists, but boy, it sure seems like a big leap to go from writing a 3 or 4 or 5,000 word short story to writing a 50,000, 60,000, 70, 80,000 word novel. And how in the world, are we going to be able to do that? And it's an anxiety a lot of writers have faced, a lot of story writers who want to transition into writing novels. Hemingway talked about it, and if you're familiar with Hemingway's stories, particularly the early ones, very, very brief. And so Ernest Hemingway wasn't sure how in the world he'd ever be able to write enough to write a full-fledged novel. And then I too felt that anxiety. I recall, as a younger writer, I was writing stories and kind of figured out how to do that, with relative ease. And then I was like, but how do you go from that to writing a novel? And over time, I think I've hit on, at least for a lot of writers, maybe what the core of that concern and that anxiety is about. And I think it's because short stories and novels we think of as sort of, part of the same family. They're both, narratives made of prose. And so we have a tendency to think of novels as just really long short stories. And if we're thinking of them in that way, then how do you go from writing a 4,000 or 5,000 word story to writing a 50 or 60 or 70,000 word story? But I think that kind of thinking and making that connection is wrong-headed. And again, I did it myself, and that's one of the reasons I know I wasn't thinking correctly way back when. The short story, I've come to realize, is probably more akin to the poem as an artistic form, and the novel is a sort of different animal altogether. And so if we're thinking of the story and the novel as being basically the same thing, just longer, then how are you going to write 50 or 60 or 70 or 80,000 words based on a conflict resolution kind of structure with a main character and some minor characters thrown in there? That does seem like an impossible task. But that's not the way to think of it. Novels are not just big short stories. In fact, I've come to understand that novels are basically a series of stories all strung together that have maybe a common thread in terms of characters, in terms of setting, etc. There are two terms that I really push back against, and those terms are a novel in stories and a conceptual novel. And a novel in stories and a conceptual novel are terms that we seem to apply to collections of short stories that are related in terms of the same characters, in terms of the same location perhaps. And I push back against those terms because all novels are novels in stories and conceptual novels. Every novel is a series of kind of smaller stories that are all kind of tied together somehow or another. And we can see it more or less easily, obviously, in some novels more so than others. And I've got some examples here. For one, let me turn to, I'll start off with the big guns, and I'll turn to what many people consider perhaps the greatest novel in the English language, James Joyce's Ulysses, right? And again, definitely considered a novel, and as I say, by many folks, maybe the greatest, most complex novel. But Ulysses, if you've ever had the pleasure, is 18 separate episodes, and they were published as separate episodes leading up to the 1922 publication of the whole book. Now, not all of them got published because there were censorship issues and obscenity law issues, and so the editors at the Little Review and other places that were trying to bring them out got into hot water. But most of them were published, independently, as sort of standalone stories and narratives before the entire book was released in 1922. And it basically follows three main characters: Leopold Bloom, Stephen Dedalus, and then Leopold Bloom's wife, Molly Bloom, as they go through a 24-hour period in Dublin in 1906. And so one episode may focus mainly on what Leopold Bloom is doing, where he goes, who he encounters, what's going on in his mind. Another episode may be about Stephen Dedalus. Another may be about Molly Bloom. And in some episodes, they interact. They run across each other and talk to each other and that kind of thing. So it's not really one big novel with a central conflict. Yes, there is one sort of overarching issue that sort of underpins the whole novel. Leopold Bloom is walking around without going home for 24 hours because he knows his wife's lover or soon-to-be lover is going to visit her at their home and consummate their relationship, and his way of dealing with it is to not deal with it. So he just won't go home and face it. So that is, again, kind of the overarching, subtext of the book and what kind of propels everything along. But boy, there's a lot of other things happening. It is a thick book. So that by itself, that would be a little short story probably. But there's all kinds of other things happening. Stephen Dedalus has issues of his own. He's a young man who's trying to kind of find his way in the world. He's got different pressures on him to choose this path versus that path. He, is estranged from his family for various reasons. Similarly, Leopold Bloom, he is separated from his daughter, because of family conflict and that kind of thing. His son died young, so that's kind of on his mind as he walks around Dublin. Again, just all kinds of things going on. And each one of them is unfolded via one of these 18 episodes, right? So, again, greatest novel in the English language, but really it's 18 more or less longish short stories, right? A lot of examples out there. Another one I want to share with you because it's not quite as obvious, but I think it still fits, and in spite of my meticulously organized bookcase behind me, I could not put my hands on my copy, although I know I have a copy, is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. And I wanted to bring it up partly because just about everybody knows that story, right? So think of that novel. Again, great novel, won all kinds of awards, made into an iconic movie. It's still being made into stage plays and all kinds of things. But it's not just one story, right? I mean, think back to Kill a Mockingbird. Maybe you read it in high school or maybe more recently. But, there's the arrival of Dill, and so there's that kind of part of the story, Dill kind of being integrated into Scout and Jim's circle. There's all the stuff with Boo Radley, who is Boo Radley? What's his backstory? All these, little trinkets and toys that Jim is finding in the old oak tree or whatever kind of tree it is. That's kind of another story thing that's going on. Obviously, we have the Tom Robbins rape trial that integrates here and there into the story. That then leads to the conflict between Atticus Finch and Bob Ewell, and then how is that all resolved? So it's one novel, but it's really a bunch of little stories that are kind of put together. They might have some thematic, connections. Obviously, they're connected in terms of the characters and the setting. But, you might say, well, they're all about, isolating the individual, alienation, prejudice, those kinds of things. So yeah, you can connect them pretty solidly for a lot of reasons, but still, it's a bunch of little stories that Harper Lee, put together, right? Another very familiar book, and this one I think is really clear to see that kind of story dynamic, is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, a book that I really like, taught it for 20 plus years. And Charlotte Bronte, when she wrote it, she definitely thought of it as a series of stories. And there are transitions in the novel where she clearly is, transitioning from one sort of subplot to the next. Obviously, in the beginning, you've got young Jane, child Jane, who's been, orphaned into the Reed household, and she's got all sorts of conflicts with her aunt and with her cousin John Reed, and so you've got all sorts of little skirmishes going on there. Jane gets locked in the Red Room and so forth. Eventually, she's sent off to Lowood Academy, which is this house of horrors for girls, orphaned girls, and she has her run-ins with Mr. Brocklehurst, and then she is befriended by Helen Burns, and there's that whole section of the novel, which is sort of a separate standalone part. She eventually leaves Lowood, goes to Thornfield Hall, where she becomes the governess. And then there's all the mysteries surrounding Thornfield Hall, and she meets Mr. Rochester, and there's obviously this budding, relationship between her and Rochester. And then she leaves Thornfield Hall, and she has a little adventure with her cousins that she doesn't even know are her cousins at first. And then she eventually goes back. So again, one biggish novel, but it's definitely divided into these little stories, or big stories, however you want to describe them, right? And it's very chronologically organized, childhood Jane, teenage, young, 20-something Jane, a little bit older Jane, a little bit older Jane, et cetera, et cetera. So when Charlotte Bronte was writing it, she obviously was thinking in terms of these little parts, not one big, massive book. Again, can you find ways to think of it as an overall kind of novel, besides just the fact the same first-person narrator is telling it all, and it's a reflective narrator looking back on her life, etc.? Yeah, there are definitely themes that come back, again and again, etc. So we can find that glue which holds it all together pretty easily, but yet I think we can also see, just like with Ulysses, it's a series of standalone stories almost, right? And if you watch movie versions of Jane Eyre, there's been lots of them, directors have to decide, what are we going to focus on? Are we going to put a lot of time into this story or that story? There's a lot of those parts that are left out of movie versions altogether, because the director or the screenwriter, whoever you want to say, decided that in the interest of time, they had to get rid of some stuff, so they kind of prioritize. Okay, these are the stories within Jane Eyre that we want to make sure we tell in this movie, and these are things that we can either skip over pretty quickly or drop altogether, right? One other example, and I think this is particularly apropos to our course on the novella and the long story, has to do with the master, William H. Gass. Gass wrote 3 novels, Omen Setter's Luck, The Tunnel, and Middle Sea. I didn't pull Middle Sea here, but I wanted to talk in particular about Omen Setter's Luck and The Tunnel. Omen Setter's Luck was Gass's first novel, 1966. Very, well received, kind of put him on the literary map. And Omen Setter's Luck is essentially a series of interconnected novellas. Gass said that his sort of natural narrative was about 70 pages. For whatever reason, when he sat down to write fiction, it almost always turned out in that sort of 70 double-spaced page range. He called it a breath. That was always the breath that he kind of wrote in. And so we have a series of these novellas in Omen Setter's Luck. Again, kind of the overarching plot is the title character, Brackett Omensetter, and his family moved to this little town in Ohio, and then the book is basically different characters who have this perspective on Brackett and his family, but particularly Brackett Omensetter, And so each section is basically a first-person narrative by different characters talking about their ideas about Brackett, their interactions with Brackett, etc. But each has their own kind of individual plot. Again, totally different characters. They've got their own deals, their own issues. And, just like with Ulysses, that was published, in part independently over several years, Gass published sections of Omensetter's Luck before the novel as a whole was published. Some of them won literary awards as standalone best story kind of pieces, etc. But definitely not just one, long narrative, but a series of connected tales. And he did it again when he wrote what many people consider his masterpiece. I think there's maybe only one better book of his than The Tunnel, but it's it's a mammoth book. It took him 26 years to write, that's kind of famously. And it's divided into 12, what he calls philippics. And it's these 12 pieces that are related because they're all by the same first-person narrator, Frederick Kohler. But they're very, very different in terms of what they talk about. They talk about his childhood, at times. They talk about his school days. They talk about his graduate school days in Germany. They talk about his love life before he got married. Talk about his marriage. Talk about his professional career as a professor of history and his colleagues. So all this stuff is talked about in these 12 different sections. But each section, again, is kind of a standalone, not novella-length piece. And again, many of them were published in whole or in part in literary journals. A couple were even published as standalone boutique press books over the years, over those 26 years. But they're interconnected novellas. But altogether, they form a really big, really complex novel, which won the American Book Award in 1995 and 1996, actually, the year after the book came out. So anyway, the lesson here that I'm trying to put forward is if you have anxiety about how do you go from a 4,000 or 5,000 word short story to a 50, 60, 70, 100,000 word novel, whatever it might be, because you're thinking of it as just one really expanded story, you're probably thinking of it not quite correctly. Perhaps what you should be doing is thinking of going from not just one story, but a series of stories, right? So instead of thinking about one long 250-page manuscript, what about 10, 25-page manuscripts, which are related because of characters, because of setting, because of theme, because of whatever, right? That seems more doable, right? Or if 25 pages isn't your normal story length, fine, 10 pages, so 20 to 25 10-page stories, right? That probably sounds more doable over time, yeah? So this is a theory that I've put into practice. When I wrote my novel, Crow Song for the Stricken, I definitely had that idea in mind of a series of interconnected stories. And part of my rationale to try to write it in that way was because of this theory I just explained to you. I had written some other novels previously and tried to write them less obviously so as a series of connected short stories. But when I wrote Crow Song, I definitely had in mind this idea of different stories with different focuses in terms of characters. They were all going to be connected, same setting, same time period, many plot overlap, subplot overlaps, that kind of thing. But I also wanted to do it in that way because I wanted to be able to send out each story as I finished it for potential publication, in literary journals and places like that. Because I knew that, obviously would kind of stoke the fire of my imagination if I'm finding some positive reinforcement from editors and so forth. And I got very lucky. And there's 12 stories altogether. All 12 were picked up and published. Some of them were published multiple times, reprinted here and there. So that worked great in terms of both as a strategy for writing a whole novel, but also as getting those individual pieces published over the years that it took me to write Crow Song for the Stricken, so that I, had some reinforcement, got those sort of good vibes from editors, responding to them positively, publishing them, etc. So that was 2017. I actually finished writing the manuscript in 2015, but a couple of the pieces had been picked up and were not going to be published until 2017. And because of the whole business of first rights, I held on to the manuscript for 2 full years waiting for those little pieces to come out. And they did. So then the novel came out in 2017. So then, a few years later, I decided I wanted to return to that world and write a prequel to Crow Song. And I wrote what turned out to be the Strophes of Job. And I used pretty much the same technique, a series of standalone short stories, each with a different focus. Again, some interactions between the characters, some of the timing of the stories overlap. So in one story, there's reference to what happens in another story. They're happening kind of concurrently, that kind of thing. But again, it worked really, really well in terms of getting regular reinforcement by having these pieces published over time, and then the novel as a whole came together. I feel like this book is a much more successful book artistically than the earlier book, which is a prequel to, but is the capriciousness of the literary world. Crow Song got quite a few accolades. I was surprised and gratified by that. The Strophes of Job, not so much. I think it got like a honorable mention for horror from one contest that I entered. Other than that, pretty much tapped out. But that's okay. In my mind, it's a better book. I took some of the concepts I had for Crow Song that I didn't think I executed as well as I could have, redid them for this book, and I feel like I did a better job in this book. But whatever. So anyway, I don't want to make this video too long. So that's the thing. If you're having some concerns, trepidation, anxiety, whatever you want to call it, because you're a story writer, you want to be a novelist at least part of the time, but you just are not having good vibes about how in the world do you go from a short story, maybe particularly if you're a flash fiction enthusiast, to something long enough to be considered a novel. Again, I think you want to recalibrate, and instead of thinking of a novel as one really big story, think of it as a series of smaller stories. I'm just going to go for an example to TV writing. I don't normally do that, but I think series writers have adapted what I'm talking about here pretty successfully in a lot of different television series. And what I mean by that is, think of different television series that you've watched where there is like an overarching narrative, and maybe it travels across episodes where it's maybe sort of the central focus or partial focus. Maybe it disappears altogether in certain episodes, but then it comes back again later. But then in those individual episodes, there oftentimes is a sort of standalone conflict and plot, right? So crime shows, procedural shows, or whatever. Again, oftentimes the main character or characters have these kind of overarching conflicts that they're kind of dealing with again, now and again throughout the series, but each episode is standalone in itself. My wife and I binged on The Mentalist last summer. We both kind of liked it when it originally was on TV, but we hadn't seen it for a few years. I don't think I ever had watched like the last couple seasons. So, we watched Patrick Jane and the California Bureau of Investigation. And if you're familiar with that series, it kind of begins with Patrick Jane, the mentalist. He's a consultant for the CBI, and his family was murdered by the serial killer known as Red John. So Patrick Jane joins the investigation to, in large part, try to catch Red John. So that's a big part of the series. That's the overarching narrative. And again, some episodes it's a main focus. Some episodes it's just barely mentioned. A lot of episodes it's not mentioned at all. But each individual episode has a standalone, crime that's been committed early on that they got to solve by the end of that 50-minute or whatever it is episode. And there are other sort of narratives that develop some romances between characters and some backstory on the different characters, particularly Patrick Jane, that kind of comes into play. So you've got this one overarching plot, find and catch Red John, the serial killer, but you've got all these individual episodes, which are like chapters in a book that have standalone conflicts that are resolved. And then you've got these other sort of subplots that develop, romances, etc., between these other characters. So TV writers have definitely adapted this idea that I'm talking about in terms of how do you go from a single short episode to a multi-part episode that may last over years if the series is successful. All right. I'm sure you can think of other examples of television series you've watched that use that very, very same kind of formula. One overarching conflict, but then each episode is kind of standalone in its own way as well. All right. I'm going to stop there. I'd be really interested to hear comments about what you think of this theory of, instead of thinking of a novel as just one big story, think of it as a series of interconnected stories or even interconnected novellas. All right. Thanks for watching.